There's a specific moment, a precise turning point in every relationship with an avoidant person where the entire dynamic shifts, where the power inverts, where they lose everything they took for granted, and you win by reclaiming yourself and your future. And this moment isn't when they finally recognize what they lost, isn't when they come back begging for another chance, isn't even when they're suffering from your absence, but is the exact moment when you stop playing their game entirely, when you refuse to continue the cycle of pursuit and accommodation and hoping they'll change, when you make the conscious choice to walk away with your dignity intact and to redirect all the energy you've been pouring into their bottomless vessel back toward yourself and toward your own life. This is where they lose. They lose someone who loved them genuinely, who understood their wounds, who had the patience and the emotional intelligence to see beneath their defenses, who offered them exactly what their wounded heart needed, even though their defended mind couldn't receive it. They lose all of this not through bad luck or bad timing, but through their own patterns that they refuse to address, through their choice to maintain their defenses rather than doing the work to become capable of receiving the love that was offered, through their assumption that you would always be available no matter how they treated you. And this is where you win. You win by choosing yourself, when staying would have meant losing yourself, by maintaining your self-respect, when continuing would have required abandoning it, by recognizing that you cannot heal someone who won't do their own healing work regardless of how much you love them or how clearly you see their potential, by understanding that the victory isn't making them change or getting them to choose you, but is choosing yourself and walking toward a future where you're no longer depleted by someone's inability to meet you in healthy, reciprocal partnership. The beautiful paradox is that your victory doesn't require their loss to be acknowledged by them. You win the moment you stop playing the game, the moment you refuse to continue accepting unacceptable treatment, the moment you recognize that your worth isn't determined by their capacity to see it, and that your future doesn't depend on their ability to become the partner you deserve. They lose when they realize too late that their patterns destroyed their chance with someone exceptional. You win when you realize your worth isn't dependent on their recognition of it, and when you choose to build life that honors you, rather than continuing to invest in someone whose patterns dishonor you, regardless of their underlying feelings or their potential to eventually change. The exact moment where their patterns cost them everything and you reclaim your power. The moment where the avoidant loses and you win isn't a dramatic confrontation or a satisfying recognition scene. It's a quiet, internal shift where you make definitive choice to stop participating in the dynamic that's been hurting you. Understanding this precise moment reveals what creates the power shift and what your victory actually consists of. The moment arrives when you recognize with clarity that cannot be unrecognized that their patterns will continue, regardless of how much you accommodate or how patient you are. There's a point in relationships with avoidance where intellectual understanding becomes embodied knowledge. You move from thinking, they have patterns that are difficult, to knowing in your bones, these patterns will not change through my accommodation, my patience, or my love alone. This shift from hope-based thinking to reality-based knowing is the turning point. It happens after you've seen enough cycles, after you've given enough chances, after you've witnessed enough repetitions that the pattern becomes undeniable. When you reach this knowing, not just thinking, but truly knowing, that accommodation won't create change, that patience alone won't heal their wounds, that your love isn't sufficient to overcome their defenses, you've arrived at the moment where their loss and your victory become possible. This moment is where they lose, because your clear-eyed recognition of pattern permanence means you're no longer willing to sacrifice yourself to patterns that won't change. And you win, because you've reclaimed your perception of reality from the hope distortion that kept you accepting unacceptable treatment. The moment arrives when you stop making their patterns about you and recognize their behavior is about their wounds, not about your worth. Throughout the relationship with the avoidant, you likely internalize their patterns, thinking maybe if you were different, if you were better, if you were less needy or more understanding, they could show up for you. This internalization keeps you trapped in the dynamic because it makes you believe you have control through changing yourself. The turning point comes when you recognize with absolute certainty that their patterns aren't about you, aren't caused by anything you're doing wrong, aren't something you can fix by becoming different. Their withdrawal is about their intimacy wounds. Their hot-cold behavior is about their fear of vulnerability. Their emotional unavailability is about their defensive structure. None of it is about your worth or your adequacy. This recognition is where they lose, because you're no longer trying to change yourself to accommodate their patterns, no longer believing their behavior is verdict on your value, and you win because you've reclaimed your self-worth from the distortion their patterns created. The moment arrives when you decide you'd rather be alone than continue depleting yourself for someone whose patterns prevent reciprocal partnership. There's a calculation that happens, often unconsciously, throughout relationships with avoidance. Is being with them, with all their patterns and limitations, better than being alone? Early in relationship, the answer is yes. The good moments outweigh the pain. The potential seems worth the struggle. But at some point, this calculation shifts. The depletion becomes unbearable. The pain outweighs the good moments. The potential stops, justifying the present reality. You reach the point where being alone, with your peace, your stability, your freedom from constant anxiety about their withdrawal, becomes preferable to continuing in relationship that requires constant accommodation of patterns that hurt you. This preference shift is the turning point. It's where they lose, because you're no longer willing to maintain relationship at any cost, no longer choosing them over yourself, and you win because you've reclaimed your priority of yourself over relationship that was costing more than it was providing. The moment arrives when you stop waiting for them to change and start building life without them as central focus. Throughout the relationship, and even after initial separations, you might have been waiting for them to get therapy, waiting for them to recognize their patterns, waiting for them to become capable of what they currently can't provide, organizing your life around this waiting and this hope. The turning point comes when you stop waiting and start building. You invest in your own life, your own goals, your own healing. You pursue interests and relationships that fulfill you. You create life that's full and meaningful without them in it. This shift from waiting to building is where they lose because you're no longer available to be accessed when they might eventually be ready, no longer organizing your life around their potential timeline for change, and you win because you're reclaiming your life and your time from the limbo of waiting for someone who might never develop the capacity you're waiting for them to develop. The moment arrives when you enforce your boundaries with finality rather than with hope they'll change to prevent enforcement. Earlier in the relationship, boundaries might have been stated, but were really ultimatums designed to motivate change. If you do this again, I'll leave. Meant, please, don't do this again, so I don't have to leave. The turning point comes when boundaries shift from being motivational tools to being protective limits. You enforce for your own well-being, regardless of whether enforcement motivates their change. You're no longer setting boundaries, hoping they'll comply, so you can stay. You're setting boundaries that you'll enforce by leaving if they're crossed, and you're at peace with leaving because your well-being is more important than maintaining relationship with someone whose patterns cross your boundaries. This shift from hope-based boundaries to protection-based boundaries is where they lose because their patterns now have real consequences they can't avoid through promises or temporary improvements, and you win because you're protecting yourself through enforced boundaries rather than hoping boundaries will control their behavior. The moment arrives when you recognize loving them and choosing them are two different things, and you can do the first without the second. This might be the most important recognition. You can love someone, can care about them deeply, can see their potential clearly, and still choose not to be with them because their current incapacity makes relationship with them harmful to you. Love doesn't obligate partnership. Caring doesn't require sacrificing yourself. Seeing potential doesn't mean staying while that potential remains unrealized and while staying depletes you. The turning point is recognizing you can hold love for them while walking away, can care about their well-being while prioritizing your own, can acknowledge the connection while refusing to continue in partnership that their patterns make unhealthy. This recognition is where they lose, because your love for them is no longer sufficient to keep you in relationship that hurts you, no longer creates obligation to stay and accommodate, and you win because you've reclaimed your right to choose yourself, even while caring about them, proving to yourself that love doesn't mean self-abandonment. The moment arrives when you stop trying to make them see your worth and start living in ways that demonstrate you see your own worth. Throughout the relationship, there's often desperate attempt to make the avoidant see your value, showing them how much you do, how patient you are, how understanding, trying to prove your worth consistent love and presence. The turning point comes when you stop trying to prove your worth to them and start demonstrating to yourself that you know your worth by making choices that honor it. You stop accepting treatment below your worth. You stop trying to convince someone to value you. You stop performing your value for someone who's too defended to recognize it. Instead, you make choices that reflect that you value yourself, setting boundaries, walking away from mistreatment, investing in yourself, choosing people and situations that honor you. This shift from proving your worth to them to demonstrating your worth through your choices is where they lose, because you're no longer seeking their validation, no longer trying to earn their consistent presence, and you win because you've reclaimed your worth as internal knowledge rather than as something requiring external validation from someone incapable of providing it. The moment arrives when you recognize that whether they eventually change is irrelevant to whether you should stay now. There's often bargaining that happens. If I stay a little longer, maybe they'll get help. If I'm patient enough, maybe they'll change. If I give one more chance, maybe this time will be different. The turning point is recognizing that maybe they'll change someday is irrelevant to whether staying now is healthy for you. Even if they eventually do address their patterns, even if 5 years from now they're in therapy and developing capacity, staying now while patterns continue would cost you those 5 years of your life and would deplete you in ways that damage your well-being. The decision to stay should be based on present reality, not future possibility. This recognition is where they lose, because your decision is based on their current capacity, not their potential future capacity, creating consequence for patterns in present, rather than continuation based on hope for future. And you win because you're making decisions based on reality rather than on hope, choosing your present well-being over potential future that may never materialize. How your refusal to play. Their game becomes their loss and your victory. The avoidance patterns create a game with specific rules: pursuit, withdrawal, accommodation, disappointment, patience, repetition. And your victory comes not from winning the game, but from refusing to continue playing it. Understanding how refusal to play creates the win-loss outcome reveals the power of withdrawal from dysfunctional dynamics. Your refusal to play becomes their loss when you stop pursuing during their withdrawals, eliminating the dynamic that allows patterns to continue without consequence. The avoidance game relies on specific sequence. They withdraw, you pursue, they return when ready, cycle repeats. Each repetition teaches them Withdrawal is safe strategy because pursuit always follows and return is always accepted. When you refuse to play by stopping pursuit during withdrawal, the game breaks. They withdraw expecting your pursuit, and instead, they get your absence. They return expecting acceptance, and instead, they get maintained boundaries. This refusal to pursue eliminates the safety net that made withdrawal sustainable. They lose because their primary pattern stops working, stops being consequence-free strategy for managing intimacy, and you win because you're no longer organizing your behavior around their patterns, no longer depleting yourself through pursuit that sustained their dysfunction. Your refusal to play becomes their loss when you stop accepting breadcrumbs as sufficient and instead require consistent, substantial investment. The avoidance game involves offering minimal effort, sporadic texts, vague plans, occasional engagement, and having this minimal effort accepted as sufficient to maintain relationship. This works because partners accept breadcrumbs, making the game sustainable where avoidant gets relationship benefits without relationship investment. When you refuse to play by requiring actual consistent investment rather than accepting breadcrumbs, the game breaks. They offer breadcrumbs expecting acceptance, and instead, you communicate clearly that breadcrumbs are insufficient, that you require actual consistent presence and engagement. They lose because minimal effort that previously sustained relationship no longer sustains it, forcing choice between increasing investment or losing relationship, and you win because you're no longer accepting insufficient treatment as sufficient. Reclaiming your standards from the gradual erosion their breadcrumbs created. Your refusal to play becomes their loss when you stop making their patterns your responsibility to manage and instead place responsibility where it belongs, with them. The avoidance game involves making their patterns something you manage. You adjust your behavior to avoid triggering their withdrawal. You accommodate their need for space. You manage their discomfort with intimacy by modulating your own needs. This makes you responsible for managing their patterns, which is unsustainable and inappropriate. When you refuse to play, by refusing this responsibility and communicating clearly that their patterns are theirs to manage, the game breaks. Their patterns become their problem, rather than your management project. They lose because they can no longer outsource responsibility for managing their patterns to you, facing full weight of their own dysfunction without buffer of your management. And you win because you're free from exhausting inappropriate responsibility of managing another adult's patterns and emotions. Your refusal to play becomes their loss when you stop waiting for potential to materialize and start evaluating relationship based on present reality. The avoidance game involves keeping partners invested through potential. They could be amazing if they address their patterns. Imagine how good this could be if they were consistent. They have such capacity if they just do the work. This potential keeps partners waiting, accepting present inadequacy for possible future adequacy. When you refuse to play by evaluating relationship based on what it is now, rather than what it could be someday, the game breaks. You stop giving credit for potential and start requiring actual demonstrated capacity in present. They lose because potential is no longer sufficient to maintain relationship, because what they're currently capable of providing is recognized as inadequate, regardless of what they might someday provide. And you win because you're making decisions based on reality rather than on hope, refusing to trade your present life for possible future that may never arrive. Your refusal to play becomes their loss when you stop interpreting their patterns through lens of their wounds and start evaluating impact on you. Throughout relationship with avoidant, there's tendency to understand everything through their perspective. They withdraw because they're scared. They're hot-cold because of childhood wounds. They're emotionally unavailable because of trauma. This understanding keeps you focused on why they do what they do, rather than on how it affects you. When you refuse to play by shifting focus from understanding their why to evaluating your experience, the game breaks. You stop making excuses for behavior based on its origins and start recognizing its impact on your well-being. They lose because understanding their wounds is no longer sufficient justification for accepting harmful patterns, because impact on you becomes relevant consideration regardless of their reasons, and you win because you're reclaiming your right to protect yourself from behavior that hurts you regardless of why that behavior occurs. Your refusal to play becomes their loss when you stop giving unlimited chances and instead communicate that opportunities are finite and have been exhausted. The avoidance game relies on unlimited chances. They mess up, you give another chance. Pattern repeats, you give another chance. Cycle continues indefinitely because chances are unlimited. When you refuse to play by communicating that chances are finite and have been used, the game breaks. You stop giving chances based on promises or hopes and communicate that you've given all the chances you're willing to give. That pattern repetition has exhausted your willingness to continue trying. They lose because unlimited chances that sustain patterns despite repetition are no longer available, because finite nature of opportunities is revealed when those opportunities are exhausted, and you win because you're enforcing limit. You should have enforced earlier, protecting yourself from continued investment in patterns that have proven resistant to change, despite multiple opportunities. Your refusal to play becomes their loss when you stop trying to make them choose you and instead choose yourself definitively. The avoidance game involves keeping you in position of trying to be chosen, trying to earn their consistent presence, trying to be worth their investment, trying to be compelling enough that they'll overcome their patterns for you. This position keeps you focused on proving yourself worthy of being chosen. When you refuse to play by choosing yourself definitively, the game breaks. You stop trying to make them choose you and instead choose yourself. Choose your well-being over relationship with them. Choose your future over their potential. Choose your peace over continued struggle. They lose because you're no longer available to be chosen when and if they're ever ready, because your choice is made and isn't dependent on their eventual choice, and you win because you're in position of power where you've chosen yourself, proving to yourself that you don't need to be chosen by someone who can't choose, consistently to recognize your worth and to build life that honors it. Your refusal to play becomes their loss when you stop believing their patterns will change through your love and start requiring evidence of actual change before reconsidering. The avoidance game involves keeping hope alive that love will heal them, that if you're patient enough or understanding enough or love them enough, they'll change. This hope sustains relationship despite patterns continuing unchanged. When you refuse to play by requiring actual evidence of change, therapy, demonstrated different behavior over sustained time, rather than accepting hope as sufficient, the game breaks. You stop believing change is coming through your continued presence and start requiring proof change has occurred before you'll reconsider. They lose because your love and presence are no longer sufficient to maintain relationship, because actual demonstrated capacity is now required rather than potential capacity being accepted, and you win because you're protecting yourself from continued investment in hope without evidence, requiring actual transformation before considering continued investment. Why walking away with dignity means you win, regardless of whether they change. The most profound aspect of your victory is that it's complete and independent of whether the avoidant ever addresses their patterns or develops capacity. Understanding why walking away with dignity is victory regardless of their eventual transformation reveals the nature of true winning in these dynamics. You win regardless of their change because your victory is choosing yourself, which is complete act independent of their response or growth. The core victory isn't getting them to change or getting them to chase you or getting them to recognize what they lost. The core victory is choosing yourself when staying would mean losing yourself. This choice is complete in itself. You're winning the battle for your own dignity, your own self-respect, your own worth. This victory doesn't require their recognition, their regret, their transformation, or their return to be complete. You chose yourself over continued depletion. That choice is the victory, and it's entirely independent of what they do afterward. If they change, your victory remains unchanged. You chose yourself at a moment when staying would have cost you. If they don't change, your victory remains unchanged. You chose yourself and avoided years more of patterns that wouldn't have improved. Your victory is about you and your choice, not about them and their response. You win regardless of their change, because maintaining your dignity and self-respect creates foundation for a healthy future, whether with them or with someone else. Walking away with dignity intact means you haven't debased yourself through begging, haven't compromised your standards by accepting unacceptable treatment indefinitely, haven't lost yourself through continued accommodation of patterns that depleted you. This maintained dignity creates foundation for a healthy future. If they eventually change and demonstrate sustained capacity, and you choose to reconsider, you're reconsidering from a position of maintained self-respect and dignity where healthy relationship is possible. If you move forward to relationship with someone else, you enter that relationship with your worth and your boundaries intact. Either way, maintaining your dignity serves your future. This is victory because it positions you for healthy relationship in whatever form that takes, while staying and losing your dignity would have positioned you for continued dysfunction, regardless of whether they eventually changed. You win regardless of their change because walking away teaches you that you can enforce boundaries even when difficult, strengthening your capacity for self-protection in all future relationships. The act of walking away from someone you care about because their treatment of you has become unacceptable teaches you a crucial lesson about yourself. You're capable of self-protection even when it's emotionally difficult, capable of enforcing boundaries even when you'd prefer not to need to, capable of choosing your well-being over relationship when necessary. This learned capacity serves you in all future relationships. You know now that you can leave if you need to, that you can enforce boundaries that protect you, that you won't abandon yourself for someone else, regardless of how much you care about them. This self-knowledge is victory that remains valuable whether the avoidant changes or not, because it protects you in all future relationships from accepting treatment you should refuse. You win regardless of their change, because your choice to leave creates only context where they might address patterns, though you win even if that context doesn't lead to their growth. The ironic reality is that your leaving is the only intervention that might motivate the avoidant to address their patterns, experiencing real consequence of permanent loss, facing the reality that their patterns cost them someone important. Your staying and accommodating would never create this motivation because accommodation removes consequence, so your leaving creates context where their growth becomes possible. If they use this context to grow, if they seek therapy and develop capacity, you win because your choice created consequence that motivated transformation. But even if they don't use this context to grow, if they continue patterns and never develop capacity, you still win because you're not there being destroyed by those continuing patterns. Your victory doesn't depend on them choosing growth. It's complete whether they grow or not. You win regardless of their change because you're free to build life without constant depletion and anxiety that relationship with them created. The concrete daily experience of your victory is peace, stability, freedom from constant anxiety about when they'll withdraw next, freedom from depletion that comes from one-sided relationship, freedom from managing someone else's patterns. This freedom exists and is valuable whether they change or not. If they change, you were free during the time they were developing capacity, rather than being depleted by patterns while hoping for change. If they don't change, you're permanently free from depletion you'd have experienced if you'd stayed. This freedom, this peace, this stability is victory you experience daily, regardless of what they're doing or whether they're growing. Your life improves through their absence, regardless of whether their life improves through addressing patterns. You win regardless of their change, because your worth is no longer dependent on their recognition of it, which is liberation that remains, regardless of whether they eventually recognize what they lost. Throughout the relationship, your worth was implicitly tied to their recognition of it. If they couldn't show up consistently, maybe you weren't worth it. If they kept withdrawing, maybe you weren't valuable enough to overcome their patterns. Walking away severs this connection. Your worth becomes internal knowledge rather than external validation. You know you're valuable because you chose yourself, because you enforce standards, because you refuse to accept treatment below your worth. This knowledge remains whether they eventually recognize what they lost or whether they never do. If they come to recognize your worth, it doesn't make you more worthy. You already knew your worth when you walked away. If they never recognize your worth, it doesn't diminish you. Your worth isn't dependent on their capacity to perceive it. This liberation from needing their recognition is victory that's complete, regardless of whether recognition eventually arrives. You win, regardless of their change, because you've proven that you value future and potential happiness over comfort of familiar patterns, even when painful. Staying would have been emotionally easier in immediate term. Familiar patterns, even when dysfunctional, have comfort of familiarity. Continuing with known person, even when patterns hurt, has less immediate fear than unknown of starting over. But you chose the harder immediate path, leaving, for better long-term outcome, chance at healthy relationship with them or with someone else. This choice demonstrates prioritization of your future over immediate comfort, willingness to face fear of unknown for possibility of better. This demonstrated capacity to choose your long-term well-being over short-term emotional comfort is victory in character development, in growth, in self-prioritization that remains valuable whether they change or not. You've proven to yourself you're capable of hard choices that serve your future, which is victory that no subsequent events can diminish. You win regardless of their change because the alternative, staying while patterns continued, would have been slow death of your spirit, your self-worth, your capacity for joy, making leaving victory simply by avoiding continued destruction. The counterfactual illuminates the victory. If you'd stayed, your self-respect would have continued eroding. Your depletion would have intensified. Your worth would have diminished in your own eyes through continued acceptance of inadequate treatment. Your capacity for joy would have been destroyed by constant anxiety and disappointment. Walking away isn't just victory because of what you're gaining, freedom, dignity, peace. It's victory because of what you're avoiding, continued destruction of yourself that staying would have guaranteed. Whether the avoidant changes or not, you've avoided this destruction. If they change, you avoided years of destruction while they were developing capacity. If they don't change, you avoided a lifetime of destruction staying would have created. Either way, avoiding this destruction is victory. What your victory looks like and how it transforms your future. The victory of walking away from the avoidant with your dignity intact manifests in specific concrete ways in your daily life and fundamentally transforms your trajectory. Understanding what victory actually looks like reveals the prize you've won by choosing yourself. Your victory looks like waking up without anxiety, about when they'll withdraw next, experiencing daily peace that comes from not managing someone else's patterns. The immediate concrete experience of victory is peace in your nervous system. You wake up and you're not immediately anxious about their mood, about whether they'll pull away today, about whether your needs will be met or dismissed, about walking on eggshells to avoid triggering their withdrawal. This absence of constant anxiety is tangible relief, is daily experience of victory. Your nervous system calms, your baseline anxiety decreases, your capacity to be present in your own life increases when you're not constantly managing or anticipating someone else's patterns. This peace is victory you experience every morning, every day, in every moment, when you're not in fight, flight, freeze response to avoidant partners' patterns. This is what winning feels like in your body. Calm, stability, peace. Your victory looks like having time and energy to invest in yourself that was previously consumed by managing dysfunctional relationship. The practical experience of victory is having your resources back, time that was spent managing their patterns, energy that was consumed by emotional labor of accommodation, mental space that was occupied by trying to understand or predict their behavior. This reclaimed time and energy can now be directed toward yourself, your goals, your healing, your interests, your growth, your joy. You take the class you'd been too depleted to take. You pursue the hobby you'd neglected. You invest in friendships you'd let deteriorate. You do therapy work on yourself rather than managing someone else's patterns. This redirection of resources toward yourself is victory you experience in how you spend your days, in what you have energy for, in what you can build when you're not pouring resources into bottomless vessel. Your victory looks like attracting healthier people and situations because you're operating from place of self-respect rather than from place of depletion. Victory transforms what you attract into your life. Operating from self-respect, after having enforced boundaries that protected you, you attract different quality of people. Healthy people are attracted to your demonstrated self-respect and your boundaries. Unhealthy people are repelled by same. They recognize you won't tolerate patterns you tolerated before. Recognize they cannot exploit you the way avoidant could earlier. This shift in what you attract is victory that transforms your dating pool, your friendships, your professional relationships. You're surrounded by people who respect boundaries because you've proven you enforce them, who reciprocate because you've proven you require reciprocity, who show up consistently because you've proven inconsistency costs access to you. Your victory looks like having standards you enforce rather than standards you compromise when someone can't meet them. Pre-victory, you might have had standards in theory, but compromised them in practice when faced with avoidant who couldn't meet them. Post-victory, you have standards you actually enforce. You know what you require, you communicate it clearly, you enforce consequences when standards aren't met. This is tangible transformation. When someone shows hot-cold behavior, you address it immediately and leave if it continues, rather than accepting it indefinitely. When someone's words don't match actions, you believe actions and respond accordingly, rather than believing words and staying confused. When emotional availability is lacking, you recognize it quickly and exit rather than staying years hoping it will develop. This enforcement of standards is victory you experience in how you navigate all relationships going forward. Your victory looks like feeling proud of yourself for having the strength to choose yourself rather than feeling shame about relationship ending. The emotional experience of victory is pride rather than shame. You're proud you had strength to leave when staying would have continued hurting you. You're proud you enforced boundaries even though it was difficult. You're proud you chose your well-being over comfort of familiar patterns. This pride contrasts with shame you might have felt if you'd stayed. Shame about accepting unacceptable treatment. Shame about losing yourself. shame about not respecting yourself enough to leave. Victory tastes like pride in yourself for hard choice that served you, and this pride builds your confidence and your sense of yourself as person capable of self-protection even when difficult. Your victory looks like having narrative about the relationship that's empowering rather than diminishing, viewing yourself as person who recognized and left dysfunction rather than as victim of someone else's patterns. How you tell the story matters. Victory is reflected in your narrative. I was in relationship with avoidant person, recognized the patterns were damaging me despite my love for them, and chose myself by leaving with my dignity intact, versus victim narrative of they destroyed me with their patterns and I was helpless victim. First narrative is empowering. You're agent of your own rescue, person who recognized dysfunction and extracted yourself. Second narrative is diminishing. You're victim of someone else's actions without agency. Victory includes claiming empowering narrative that recognizes your strength and your choice, rather than narrative that frames you as victim of someone else's patterns without agency to protect yourself. Your victory looks like being open to love again while having clearer sense of what's healthy and what's not, able to recognize red flags early. Victory doesn't mean being closed off to future relationships. It means entering future relationships with wisdom gained through experience. You can recognize avoidant patterns early now. You can identify hot-cold behavior in early dating. You can distinguish between healthy, need for occasional space, and avoidant withdrawal pattern. You can recognize future faking and breadcrumbing and other games. This pattern recognition allows you to exit quickly when patterns appear, rather than investing years hoping patterns will change. Victory is being open to love while being protected by knowledge that helps you recognize unhealthy patterns early enough to exit before significant investment and damage occur. Your victory ultimately looks like life you're building that reflects your values and serves your well-being, rather than life organized around someone else's patterns and limitations. The comprehensive experience of victory is life that's yours. Choices based on what you want, rather than on accommodating someone else's limitations. Goals you pursue because they matter to you, rather than goals abandoned because they conflicted with managing someone else's patterns, relationships that add to your life rather than deplete you. Daily experience of life that serves your well-being, rather than life that sacrifices your well-being for someone else's comfort. This life you're building is victory made manifest. Every choice that honors you, every boundary that protects you, every relationship that reciprocates, every goal you pursue, every moment of peace and joy. These are all evidence of your victory, all fruits of choosing yourself, all confirmation that walking away was winning, even though it felt like losing in the moment. They lost someone who loved them, someone who could have been their partner if they'd developed capacity. And you won yourself back, won your future, won your peace, won your dignity, won your life. And that victory is complete whether they ever recognize what they lost or not, whether they ever developed the capacity they lacked or not, because your victory was never about them or their transformation, but was always about you choosing yourself and building life that honors you, rather than continuing to sacrifice yourself for someone whose patterns prevented them from honoring you, regardless of how much they might have cared beneath their defended surface.